to episode 4 of GameDev Building Blocks. This one's going to basically extend directly after the last episode. So if you haven't seen the last episode, episode 3, introducing functions, I would definitely watch that if you're not familiar with functions. Recall that in that episode, we talked about functions and we used an analogy of a recipe. You have a recipe, let's say, for making cookies, where you essentially follow a set of instructions and you kind of follow them the same way every time to kind of get a certain consistent behavior, right? In the case of a recipe, the consistent behavior you want is enjoying delicious cookies afterwards. But we talked about how that idea can be applied to concepts in programming. Now, one of the things that I want to think about a little bit is, let's think about this cookie baking recipe and let's think about what if it serves, let's say, for example, let's say it creates 24 cookies. And let's say that you know that for your event that you're giving, you actually want to have 48 cookies. Well, how are you going to go about adjusting your recipe to compensate for that? Are you going to follow the recipe one time all the way through and then follow the recipe all the way through a second time? Probably not, right? If you've ever kind of doubled a recipe before, what you do is you, for example, if the original recipe calls for, let's say, 2 cups of flour, then you'll do 4 cups of flour, right? And if maybe it's 1 teaspoon of vanilla, you'll maybe do 2 teaspoons of vanilla, right? And you might not be thinking that hard when you're doing this, but what you're essentially doing is you're accepting some kind of parameter. I'm using that word specifically. You're accepting some kind of parameter which is then changing the way that your instructions are performed, right? So in this case, in the original recipe, the original parameter was we just want to make one batch of 24 cookies, so we'll follow the recipe exactly as written. But then the next time we call that function or, use that recipe, we get a different value for that parameter. In this case, we want to actually create 48 cookies, right? So we will just double the recipe. What's happening is your recipe is able to take a parameter and then adjust its instructions based on that parameter. And that's very similar to how parameters work with functions, okay? So parameters are values that can be passed into your function that will then change the behavior of the function. And when I say pass in, if you think about like the game soccer, if you pass, right, you're giving the ball from one player to another. So when we pass in a parameter, we are passing in information to our function, okay? The other thing I want to make clear, in computer programming jargon, you will also see the term arguments used interoperatively with the term parameters, okay? So when you hear somebody say, oh, that function takes 2 arguments, another way to think about that is they're saying, oh, that function takes 2 parameters, okay? So that's kind of the idea of parameters, also known as arguments. And then we will explore how to give our function parameters next. So if we look at our function that we created last time, we have this level up function here. And basically, if we wanted to, just like we talked about earlier, kind of double our recipe, we could call the function twice, right? And that's okay. But a better way to maybe think about this would be to give our function parameters and let that change the behavior of the function. So where do parameters / arguments go in our function? Well, they actually go inside the parentheses, okay? So I'm going to say that for my level up function, I'm going to say the first parameter will be num of levels, okay? So that's going to be the name of my parameter. Now, this part is where things can start to get a little bit confusing for people. What I'm doing here is I am giving a name to my parameter. And just to kind of keep things tidy, let's say that it has to be an int, right? So remember we talked about static typing. So we're saying the name of the parameter is number of levels and it has to be an integer, okay? And so what I'll do is I will simply multiply each of my stat gains by the number of levels, right? And the autocomplete's kind of helping me out here. What does this allow me to do? It allows me to now, whenever I call level up, I'm going to pass in the number of levels that I want to do, and that will populate throughout my function. So anytime you see number of levels, when the actual function gets run, it will be replaced with the value that was here, okay? It can be a little tricky for people when they're starting out. So don't worry if that's a little confusing. The more you kind of practice it, the easier it gets. So for example, let's just make sure that we didn't break anything. So let's just level up one time, right? Now notice if I want to level up one time, I have to tell it one time, right? Because now we're taking a parameter, okay? So let's see what happens here. I made the output font a little bigger so it's easier to see. So Barbarian's health after leveling up one time is 105. Well, that's what we expect, right? Remember, our starting health was 100, and you get 5 health for every level. So that appears to be working. Now watch this. What happens after 10 levels? Well, let's see. It looks like the Barbarian's health is now 150. And that is what we would expect it to be, right? 10 times 5, 50. So it appears that we have successfully added a parameter or an argument. I tend to use those two words interchangeably, so I want to introduce both of those words now because when we're learning more advanced stuff later on, I don't want to, I'm liable to say the words argument and parameter interchangeably. I don't want you to be confused. That's why I'm making such a big to-do about it now, okay? So that's that basically. That's kind of the basics when it comes to parameters. Now, one thing that people sometimes get a little bit confused about is something like this. So let's say I have like a new variable called levels gained from rare candy. And I know rare candy only gives one level, but let's just say for example it gives 2, okay? I can actually do this. I can pass a variable into my function. And this tends to throw people off because what I see from new students a lot of times is they think that because up here the parameter is named number of levels, then that means that this has to be named number of levels. Like they think that they have to have the same name. They could, but they don't have to. And in fact, I tend to prefer that they don't because I want to make the distinction. Yes, number of levels is the name of the parameter, right? So as far as the function is concerned, it thinks that the name is number of levels, right? But as far as the value that it's assigning to this, right? Each of these number of levels is going to be replaced by a number. It doesn't really care that it's called levels gained from rare candy. It just knows that it's a 2, right? And because we said that this parameter is an integer, it basically doesn't really care about the name. It's just like, oh, you gave me a 2. Awesome. That's an integer. We can play ball, basically, right? That's what's going on, right? So I could pass it like a number of levels explicitly like a number, or I could pass it any other value that is a integer, okay? Now watch what happens if I try to pass it a float. Level up, let's say level up 2.5 times, okay? Now, it's not gonna yell at me here, okay? But it is gonna give me a warning and say narrowing conversion, float is converted to int, loses precision. So it is trying to help you out and say, hey, you know what? You told me you were supposed to give me an int, and you're not giving me an integer here, so are you sure you want to do that, right? So that's something to think about. So that is how we add parameters, also known as arguments, to our functions. And in the next part, we'll see a practical use of this in our RPG game. Thanks for sticking around. All right, so here we are inside TBS The Last Roundup, our RPG game, and we can see actually a very important function here this is actually where the damage calculation happens, okay? What I want you to focus on is these parameters that we have, okay? Now, the name of the function is init, okay? And there's a reason why it's called that. The reason, for the purposes of this kind of lesson, it's not really related to that. So, if you keep following along with the videos, eventually you'll probably understand why it's called that. But for now, just know that it's just the name of a function, right? It could be named like damage calculation for all we know, right? But let's look at the parameters. It takes one parameter named attacker, which is type battler. So battler is a specific custom type for our game. So we talked about types like floats and ints and things like that. Well, we can create our own custom types too, and I will definitely teach you how. But for now, just understand that battler is a special type that is specific to our game. So we take one parameter named attacker, which is of type battler. We take another parameter called defender, which is also of type battler. Then we take a parameter called ability, which is of another custom type that we have called basic ability. Here, we're using a parameter called override damage, okay? And it is an integer. And when you set it equal to 0 like this, what you're doing is you're providing a default parameter for, a default value for that parameter, okay? So what we're basically doing with the override damage parameter is we're defaulting to 0, but there's certain moves in the game that override damage. So for example, one of them is our barbarian has a counterattack, where if the barbarian uses counterattack, if he gets hit by a physical move, he'll just straight up counterattack for double the damage, okay? So because it works like that, it's special. It doesn't use the same damage calculations that the other moves in the game use. So because of that, we have this optional parameter override damage. Now, for 99% of the moves in the game, this value is always 0, so that's why we default it to 0. Okay, but there's still a parameter called overwrite damager that's an integer, and you can use that if you want to. And rarity of source, and that's also an integer, and it defaults to 0. And that is used for, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think there might be certain moves that, because in our game, each move has a rarity. It's green for common, blue for epic, and blue for rare and purple for epic. World of Warcraft, please don't sue us. But there's certain moves that interact with that idea. So here's another parameter that we get. It's called rare. The name of the parameter is rarity of source. It's an integer, and we're defaulting to 0. So most of the time, these two parameters aren't used. Most of the time, we're just worried about these first 3 parameters, right? We have an attacker, we have a defender, and then we have an ability. And anytime you see a reference to attacker, so for example, right here where it says attacker, right? That's us using that parameter to change the behavior of our recipe, right? Just like, we passed in parameters to our cookie baking recipe to shrink it or grow it, just like that, we're passing in information to allow us to change the behavior of our function, okay? So, I realize if you haven't been coding very long, a function like this might look a little bit intimidating. I promise it's not. But what I want you to kind of understand, this is us using parameters in order to have a one-size-fits-all damage calculation function. Because the great thing about this is no matter which ability, so we'll fire up the game just to kind of show here a little bit so you can see this in context, but it doesn't matter which 2 abilities are going against each other. It doesn't matter which 2 abilities are going against each other, that same function is used to calculate damage. And all we're doing to change the instructions, to change the behavior of the function, is to put in the different parameters, right? So here we're going to pass with our with our guy. We're going to pass with our grass mage. The grabber drone's going to take away our ability to switch with his assist move that says, let me get my grabber. So now we can't switch out because that's an assist move that actually takes away my ability to switch. But now we're going to fight, okay? And then I'm going to use Flame Strike. So when I use this Flame Strike, somewhere behind the scenes, right, we're passing 3 parameters to our init function. The attacker is going to be our barbarian. The defender is going to be this person here. And the ability is going to be Flame Strike, right? And boom, we get our damage calculation. Turns out we did 5. Okay? So that is how that works. So now you've seen the power of parameters. We use them all the time. So many, 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 many functions in your code base are going to use parameters. So it's really important to understand them and make friends with them, and don't be afraid of using them because they're really powerful, right? They actually make you, if you're lazy like I am, they actually are your best friend because they let you reuse code, right? So you can take code that you've written that works really well and have it adapt to numerous situations in your game, all because you were able to pass in parameters and change the behavior on the fly. So I hope that makes sense, and that will end episode 4. Thanks so much for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.